The name fell from Iris Wren's lips like a blade unsheathed in a silent room. Elder Valdres Morvain. Every head in the Grand Council chamber turned. Every pale, ageless face went rigid. The chandeliers overhead, fitted with black iron and cold electric light that mimicked candle flame, seemed to flicker, though there was no wind, no draught, nothing to disturb the dead air of the underground court that sat 6 stories beneath a luxury hotel in the center of Vienna. Iris stood in the middle of the marble floor, still wearing her grey maid's uniform, a folded silver tray tucked under one arm, her dark hair loose at one shoulder where the pin had come free during the chaos of the last 20 minutes. She did not stop Sullivan. Elder Caspian Rue. Her voice carried without effort, clear and unhesitating, striking the vaulted stone ceiling and coming back to her like an echo that confirmed its own truth. Elder Noctis Halvain, Elder Seravain of the Eastern bloodline, and Elder Priya Dorveth, who is sitting in that chair right now and has not yet moved because she believes I cannot prove what I know. Priya Dorveth, 8 centuries old, with silver-white hair coiled at her neck and violet eyes that had watched empires fall, went utterly still. Ambrose Drazhan, Duke of the Drazhan blood seat and sovereign lord of the Vienna court, stood at the far end of the chamber. He was chained, both wrists bound by silver-threaded cord to iron rings embedded in the floor, his white coat torn at the shoulder, his long white hair disheveled from the struggle that had put him there. He was the most dangerous thing in the room, and everyone knew it, which was exactly why 6 of the oldest vampires in existence had chosen to chain him rather than reason with him. His eyes, deep crimson at the center and black at the rim, were fixed on Iris with an expression she had never seen on his face before in the 8 months she had worked in his court. He looked afraid. Not for himself, for her. "You will stop speaking," Elder Morvain said quietly. He was tall, thin, dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Iris made in a year, and he had the particular stillness of something that had practiced cruelty for so long it no longer felt it. "You are a human servant. You have no standing in this chamber and no protection under blood law. I suggest you place that tray on the table and leave before you become a problem we must solve." Iris looked at him. She had looked at him many times before, carrying wine and dispatches and sealed letters he never believed she read, because the court had assumed, with its ancient and self-satisfied certainty, that the human maid knew nothing at all. "I have copies," she said. "Every letter, every meeting log, every entry in Elder Vaughan's private cipher that I decoded using the key she keeps under the 3rd panel of the East Corridor floor, which she changes every new moon, and which I have documented for the last 6 months." She reached into the interior pocket of her uniform jacket and produced a small black flash drive, holding it up between 2 fingers. "This is in 3 places simultaneously. If I do not check in within the next 40 minutes, all of it goes to every major human law enforcement database and every vampire court contact I was able to identify in Elder Rue's correspondence," which was extensive. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Iris had ever heard. Then Ambrose Drazhan laughed. It was short and low and edged with something fierce and bright, and it broke the frozen tableau like a stone through glass. "I told you," he said, to no one and everyone, his voice rough but controlled despite the silver burning at his wrists. That she was exceptional. It had begun 8 months ago on a wet October evening when Iris Wren had answered a job posting on a private staffing agency's encrypted portal. She had accessed through a series of digital backdoors that would have impressed most professional security consultants had any of them known she existed. She had been 24 years old, recently graduated with a double degree in archival studies and linguistics, fluent in 6 languages and conversationally capable in 3 others, and completely, deliberately, invisibly broke, not because she lacked skill, because she had spent 2 years quietly investigating a disappearance that the Vienna police had closed without resolution and that the relevant authorities had declined to reopen. The disappearance of her older brother, Daniel Wren, who had taken a security job at a private estate outside the city 18 months prior and had sent her increasingly strange letters before going silent entirely. The estate had belonged to a vampire named Ambrose Drazhan. Iris had not known that when she applied. She had suspected something inhuman was involved, because Daniel's final letter had described his employer as someone who did not sleep and whose eyes changed color with his mood, and because the building address had appeared in no public record, and the company name had no registered footprint, and because Iris Wren was the kind of person who noticed things like that. What she had not expected was that the job would be real and cleanly paid, and that the first morning she arrived at the underground court with its hidden entrance behind a wardrobe door in the hotel's closed east wing, a tall, white-haired vampire in a grey coat would look at her with those dark crimson eyes and say, "Very calm, the person I hired. The agency sent me instead," Iris had replied, which was true because she had very carefully arranged for that to happen. Why the other candidate was unreliable, also true. She had ensured it. "I am not." He had studied her for a long moment with the particular intensity of a creature that could read a heartbeat and distinguish a lie from truth by the slight hesitation before the word. Then he had said, "Your name, Iris Wren, Iris Wren," he repeated, and something in the way he said it suggested he was filing it somewhere permanent. "You will begin today. You will not enter the archive level without escort. You will not speak to council members unless spoken to. You will not attempt to read any correspondence left unattended in the formal rooms." "Of course," Iris had said, and had proceeded, over the following 8 minutes, to do all 3 of those things with extraordinary care and thoroughness. She had not found what she came looking for. At first, Daniel was not in the court. He had left the estate nearly a year before her arrival. She discovered from a household log she was not supposed to find, and the notation beside his name said, "Simply transferred with no destination recorded." It was not the word of someone who had been harmed. It was the word of someone who had been moved. She kept looking. What she found instead was a conspiracy 8 centuries in the making, woven through the foundations of the Vienna court like rot through old timber, invisible from the surface and catastrophic at the core. She found it not because she went looking for it, but because she was very good at her job, which meant she was in every room, at every correct moment, carrying things that required her presence and permitted her invisibility. Human servants at vampire courts were not watched the way vampire courtiers watched each other. They were background, they were furniture, they were the grey uniformed figures who refilled glasses and removed dishes, and were so thoroughly beneath notice that they might as well have been ghosts. Iris had used that invisibility like a precision instrument. She had catalogued, cross-referenced, and memorized the movements of 6 elders. She had decoded Thessaly Vaughan's cipher within 3 weeks of finding it, because Vaughan was extremely clever, but had a weakness for numerical patterns derived from dates, and Iris had identified that weakness by reading the correspondence Vaughan had with a contact in Prague, which was written in clear text, and which Iris had read while dusting the mantelpiece on which it sat. She had mapped the financial architecture of Caspian Roux's external accounts through the paper trails visible in his dispatches, using the same skills that had made her the best archival researcher in her graduate program, and which no one had ever thought to worry about because she was just the maid who brought the wine. She had also, somewhere in those 8 months, despite every intention not to, begun to understand Ambrose Drazhan, not as a subject of investigation. As a person, he was not what she had expected, though she would have been hard-pressed to articulate exactly what she had expected. A monster, perhaps, in the cartoonish sense, or at minimum a cold and autocratic sovereign who treated his human staff as resources. He was neither of those things. He was exacting and controlled and capable of a silence so complete it felt like its own form of pressure. But he was also quietly, consistently fair in a way that seemed to come from genuine principle rather than performance. When one of the kitchen staff had been injured in a supply accident, he had paid for her medical care without being asked and had kept her position open for her return. When a junior courtier had made a diplomatic error that had nearly caused an incident with the Prague House, Ambrose had accepted public responsibility for the mistake himself, privately corrected the courtier and never mentioned it again. He had also gradually begun to notice Iris, not in a way that alarmed her, in a way that was more unsettling than alarm, because it was specific. He noticed when she had not slept. He noticed when she was working through a problem, because she had a particular stillness when thinking that he had apparently catalogued the same way she catalogued his. He had, on 3 separate occasions, placed a cup of coffee on the surface nearest her before she asked for it, which was a small thing, and which meant nothing except that he had been paying attention. The 4th time, she had looked up from the correspondence she was organizing and found him standing at the window that overlooked the false courtyard below, his hands clasped behind his back, white coat stark against the dark stone. "Why do you stay?" he had asked, without turning around. "You are talented enough to work anywhere. The compensation here is adequate but not extraordinary. The hours are nocturnal, which is not natural for you, and you do not entirely trust this court." Iris had set down the letters. "What makes you say I do not trust it?" "Because you are careful in a way that is not habitual tidiness," he had said. "It is protective. You move through rooms as though you are mapping exits." He had turned then, and his eyes were that particular shade of deep burgundy that she had come to associate with a mood she could only describe as genuine attention. "I am not asking you to confess to anything, Iris Wren. I am telling you that I have noticed, and that I do not find it threatening. I find it curious." A pause, and something else, but I am not yet certain what to call it. She had not answered him directly. She had said, "My brother disappeared from a position with your estate 18 months ago. I came here to find out what happened to him." She did not know why she told him. It was not strategic. It was possibly the least strategic thing she had done since arriving, and she had a second's vertiginous awareness of that as the words left her mouth. He had been very still. Then he had said, "Daniel Wren, yes." He transferred to the Bucharest house at his own request. He met someone there, a court archivist named Celia Morvain, who is distantly related to Elder Morvain, but holds no political alignment with him. "Your brother is alive and well, and has been in Bucharest for 13 months. He had reached into his coat and produced a phone, and after a moment he had turned it toward her. On the screen was a photograph, clearly recent, of her brother standing in front of an ornate library with his arm around a dark-haired woman, both of them laughing. Iris had gripped the edge of the desk and breathed once very carefully. "I had his transfer records sealed because he asked me to," Ambrose continued, and his voice had shifted to something lower and more careful, the way it did when he was navigating something delicate. He was concerned that a family member might worry and attempt to investigate, and he was not yet prepared to explain his situation. I respected that request, though I will acknowledge now that it created unnecessary pain, and I am sorry for it. She had looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she had looked at Ambrose. "You kept his confidence even though it meant someone who cares about him was afraid for him." He asked me to. Agreements of that kind matter. His jaw had tightened slightly. Perhaps more to me than to most, given that this court operates on very little else. That was the night, if she was being honest with herself, that the architecture of her feelings had shifted. Not into immediate love, because Iris was not the kind of person who fell quickly into anything except research, but into something she had not planned for and could not easily categorize, which was trust. Specific, earned, considered trust given to a vampire duke in an underground court, which was the most improbable thing she had ever done, and which she had undone anyway, because it was the logical conclusion of the evidence she gathered over 8 months of careful observation. She had told him that same night about the cipher, about the meeting logs, about the financial architecture she had been quietly building in her head. She had not told him everything immediately. She had told him enough to watch how he responded, and he had responded with the controlled, precise attention of someone who understood immediately that what he was being handed was not gossip, but a well-constructed case, and who treated it accordingly. He had asked methodical questions. He had not dismissed anything. He had looked at her with an expression that was not surprise, exactly, but something raw and more complicated. "How long have you known?" he had asked. "Enough to be certain for 3 months. Suspicious for 5. And you did not leave if I left without telling you. They would have moved against you before you knew they were coming." She had said, simply, "I could not do that." He had looked at her for a long moment that stretched into something that neither of them had named. Then he had said very quietly, "Iris," just her name, the way he had said it on the first day, as though filing it somewhere permanent. Except this time it sounded different. It sounded like something he was being careful with. The conspiracy, once Iris and Ambrose began working through it together, was even larger than she had mapped alone. 6 elders, as she had identified, each with separate motives that converged on a single goal: the removal of Ambrose from the blood seat, the dissolution of his court, and the redistribution of his territorial authority among themselves. The motive was not personal hatred, though she suspected Morvain had some history with Ambrose that made it personal for him. The motive was power, arranged through a blood law invocation that had not been used in 4 centuries. The ancient blood law in question was called the Covenant of Unfit Stewardship. It allowed a majority of the Elder Council to remove a blood seat sovereign if they could prove, before a quorum of elder witnesses, that the sovereign had failed 3 enumerated duties of the seat. The 6 conspiring elders had spent years fabricating or misrepresenting the evidence for those failures, working slowly and carefully, and counting on the fact that Ambrose trusted his court and that no one would warn him because no one who knew would dare, and because the humans in his service were considered invisible. They had not considered Iris Wren. The trap had sprung 2 nights ago. The elders had convened an emergency session under false pretenses, produced their fabricated evidence, and moved to invoke the covenant before Ambrose could summon allies or contest the claims. When he had attempted to speak against the evidence, Morvain had ordered him restrained under the procedural authority the covenant granted to the calling elders during a formal invocation. The silver-threaded bonds were legal under the covenant's terms. Everything had been done correctly, procedurally, precisely. The kind of betrayal that was most difficult to fight because it wore the clothing of legitimate process. As Iris had carrying a dispatch tray in the corridor outside, when she heard the sound of the chamber doors sealing, she had known immediately. She had been in the East Wing archive 40 minutes before, pulling the last piece of documentation she needed, and she had run the numbers in her head as she walked back and understood that the timing was not coincidental. They were moving tonight. They had chosen tonight specifically because 2 of Ambrose's most loyal allies were traveling and could not return in time. She had not panicked. She had gone to the server room 2 levels up, where the court's private communication infrastructure was routed. And she had done in 20 minutes what she had been quietly preparing to do for 2 months. She had split and encrypted every piece of documentation she had gathered and distributed it to the 3 secure locations she had arranged, one of which was a human law enforcement contact she had cultivated at Interpol who knew nothing of vampires, but who knew excellent evidence when it arrived in his inbox. Then she had walked back down to the chamber level, picked up the silver tray she had set outside the door, straightened her uniform, and used the emergency manual override on the chamber's secondary door, which she knew about because she had dusted the panel that concealed it every Tuesday for 8 months. She had walked into the middle of an 8th-century-old blood law tribunal and named every elder who had violated it, because the exquisite irony of the covenant of unfit stewardship, which Iris had read 3 times in the original archival Latin, and once in its annotated 17th-century translation, was that it had provisions for its own abuse. If it could be demonstrated that the invoking elders had fabricated or falsified the evidence presented, the covenant inverted. The elders who had called it became subject to it, and the remedy for a falsified invocation was not removal. It was forfeiture. Every seat, every territory, every century of accumulated authority surrendered to the wrongfully accused sovereign. Iris knew this. She was fairly certain most of the elders in the room had forgotten it existed, because the provision had never been used and because it was buried in the 3rd addendum of the original text, which was written in a dialect of ecclesiastical Latin, so archaic it was essentially a dead language within a dead language. She also had every piece of documentation required to prove the fabrication. Iris. Ambrose's voice from the center of the room was low and controlled, but she could hear something underneath it that she had only heard from him a handful of times, and which she had begun to privately identify as the sound he made when he was trying very hard not to do something extreme. "Get away from the elders. Come to me, I am fine exactly where I am," she said. "You are standing 12 feet from 6 individuals who have several centuries of practice at making problems disappear, and who are currently calculating whether to do that to you," he said, with the particular precision of someone communicating urgency without causing panic. "Please come to me." Elder Morvain's expression had shifted from cold command to something more calculated. He was, Iris knew, running the same arithmetic she was, trying to determine whether her claim about the documentation was real or a bluff. She could see him looking at the flash drive in her hand and deciding it was probably real, because a bluff in this room against these odds would require a particular kind of either stupidity or certainty, and she had never in 8 months shown any sign of stupidity. "I want to see this documentation," Elder Dorveth said from her chair. Her voice was very steady. She was, Iris had always thought, the most intelligent of the 6, and also the one who had the most to lose from an inverted covenant, because her territory in the Eastern bloodlines was the largest consolidated holding in the European network. "You will," Iris said, "as will the quorum that will need to validate it. Under the covenant's own procedural terms, which require that a falsification claim be reviewed by a quorum of non-aligned witnesses before the invocation can be confirmed or inverted." She looked at Dorveth steadily. "I know the required quorum size. I know the names of the unaligned elders in this court. I know their home addresses, their personal communication methods, and the fact that 3 of them are in Vienna right now because I organized their accommodations." A sound moved through the chamber, not quite breathing, since most of the vampires present did not need to breathe in the human sense, but something analogous. A shift in the collective weight of 8 centuries of presence and power, recalibrating in response to a 24-year-old human woman in a grey uniform who had done her homework. "Release him," said a new voice. Elder Vascan Threnody, one of the court's oldest unaligned elders, had stepped through the secondary door behind Iris. He was compact and silver-haired, and ancient in the way of very old mountains, heavy with accumulated time, and his grey eyes moved from Iris to Ambrose, to the restrained wrists, and then to Morvain with an expression that contained no warmth at all. "Morvain, release the Duke. Now, Threnody, you have no standing here until a quorum is convened," Morvain began. "I am the court's procedural witness." "I always have standing," Threnody looked at Iris. "I heard what was named. I will summon the others." He looked back at Morvain. "Release him before I add obstruction of procedural process to the list of things this human woman appears to have documented." Iris was not entirely sure how Threnody had known to come. Later, reviewing the sequence of events, she suspected that Ambrose had found some way to send word before the chamber sealed, or that Threnody had been watching the court's internal movements with his own suspicion and had simply needed confirmation. Either way, she was grateful for him, though she was not going to let him see that she had needed him. The silver-threaded bonds were removed. The sound of them hitting the marble floor was very clean and final. Ambrose moved across the chamber toward Iris in the particular way he moved when he was controlling a deep and dangerous impulse, very precisely, and at a speed that was technically humanly plausible, but carried something underneath it that was not human at all, a coiled readiness that she felt against her skin, like static before lightning. He stopped directly in front of her. He was taller than her by almost a foot, white-haired and white-skinned and dishevelled from the bonds, with a thin mark at each wrist where the silver had burned him. His crimson eyes were fixed on her face with an intensity that made the chamber and the elders and the blood law procedure feel very far away. "You walked in here alone," he said. "I walked in here with documentation and a 40-minute countdown," she corrected. "Iris, you were in danger." His jaw moved, a muscle in it pulled tight. "You were not supposed to be in danger. That was the entire point of keeping you away from the council rooms these last 2 weeks. I knew something was moving. I was trying to keep you clear of it." She stared at him. "You knew. I suspected." I did not know what I know now, because you had not yet told me the full scope of what you found." He reached up and very carefully, with a deliberateness that was obviously intentional, tucked the loose strand of hair back from her face. His fingers were cool against her temple, and she felt the touch all the way down to her feet. "I was trying to protect you," he said quietly. "And you walked directly into the thing I was trying to protect you from." "To protect you," she said, meeting his eyes. Something passed over his face, something that broke through the control, briefly, like light through a crack in stone, raw and unguarded and enormous. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said very low, "I am aware of that. It is the most frightening thing that has happened to me in a considerable number of years, and I am several centuries old." Behind them, Elder Threnody had already produced a communication device and was speaking rapidly to someone in the old tongue. Around the chamber, the 6 conspiring elders stood in various postures of controlled, furious calculation, none of them yet willing to make a move that would add action to their already considerable list of documented offenses. The procedural machinery was now in motion. It could not be stopped without making everything worse, and they all knew it. Iris looked at Ambrose's wrists. The burns were already fading, vampire healing, knitting the skin closed with quiet efficiency. But they had been real wounds, and she felt something fierce and protective move through her in response to seeing them, which was not a feeling she would have described herself as capable of 2 weeks ago, and which she was clearly going to have to examine later. "Come," he said, and his hand found the small of her back, the lightest possible pressure that was somehow also completely unambiguous, guiding her toward the chamber's side alcove and away from the remaining elders. "Threnody will manage the procedure from here. You do not need to stand in the center of this room any longer." "I have the documentation on the drive," she said. "And the countdown, and the 3 backups. I know. You were very thorough. You are always very thorough." There was something in his voice that she would have called tenderness if she allowed herself to use that word about an 800-year-old vampire, Duke, who had spent the last month carefully not saying anything about the way he looked at her. "Will you tell me now what you could not tell me before? Everything that is on that drive?" "Everything," she agreed. They spent the next 4 hours in the alcove, and then in his study adjacent to the chamber, going through everything together while Threnody convened the emergency quorum in the grand hall above them. Iris walked Ambrose through every document, every decoded cipher entry, every financial thread she had traced. He listened with the focused, methodical attention that she had come to think of as one of his most characteristic qualities, the way he could hold a complex structure in his mind and rotate it, examining each facet without losing the shape of the whole. Twice he went very quiet in a way that was not contemplative stillness, but something closer to anger, controlled to the point where it was almost invisible, except that she could see it in the set of his shoulders and the slight change in the color of his eyes, which deepened towards something closer to black when he was angry in the way that was old and deep and rarely showed on the surface. The second time was when she showed him the entry in Morvain's decoded correspondence that made clear the conspiracy had been active for 6 years. 6 years of careful, patient, incremental fabrication conducted right under his authority by people he had believed were part of his court in good faith. 6 years, he said very quietly. "Yes, I sat in meetings with Morvain for 6 years." He looked at the screen, at the decoded text, and his expression was the kind of stillness that was harder to read than anger because it was deeper. I trusted this court. You were not naive, she said. You were operating in good faith within a structure that was being systematically corrupted from within. That is not the same as being foolish. He looked at her. You trusted people who were not trustworthy, she continued. That is a thing that happens to everyone, including people who have been alive for several centuries. The failure was theirs, not yours. You are being kind, he said. I am being accurate, she said. There is a difference, and I think you know it. The silence between them shifted. It had been shifting, she thought, for months, incrementally the way pressures shift beneath the earth, before something finally gives. She was aware of him the way she was aware of the temperature in a room, constantly, involuntarily, as a fact of the environment rather than a choice. Iris Wren, he said, and it was the third time he had said her name in that particular way, the careful way, the way that suggested he was being deliberate about it. Yes, she said, which was not an answer to a question, but felt like one. I need to tell you something. He set down the faux phone he had been holding and turned to face her fully, and she had the particular awareness of being looked at by someone who was seeing her entirely, not the maid's uniform or the useful employee or the inconvenient human in the middle of a vampire power structure, but her, specifically, the actual whole person of her. I am aware that the situation is complicated. I am aware that you came here originally for your brother, and that you stayed for reasons that evolved, and that the power differential between us is not insignificant. I want to be honest with you about all of that, and I want to say that none of it changes what I have been trying not to say since approximately the 4th month of your employment. She waited. I find you extraordinary, he said. Not because of what you did tonight, though what you did tonight may be the most remarkable thing I have witnessed in my very long life. I find you extraordinary because of who you are when you are doing nothing at all, when you are reading in the East Corridor, or arguing with the inventory system, or explaining something to one of the junior staff with that precise patience you have that is somehow never condescending. His voice was very quiet and very level, the way it was when he was saying something important and not decorating it. I have been alive for 843 years, Iris, and I have never once felt about any person what I feel when I see you walk into a room. She breathed once carefully. How long have you been not saying that? Since the night you told me about your brother, and I understood that you had stayed here, at potential risk to yourself, to protect me from something you had discovered without being asked to discover it. His jaw was tight. I have been extraordinarily disciplined about not saying it, because I did not want to complicate your position here, and because I was not certain you felt the same. I do feel the same, she said. I have been equally disciplined about not saying it, for approximately the same reasons. Something in his face changed completely, the control dropping away all at once, and what was underneath it was something unguarded and luminous and so deeply genuine that it was almost difficult to look at directly, the way looking at something very bright is almost difficult. He leaned forward and put his forehead against hers, very carefully, and the coolness of his skin against her warmth was the most natural feeling she had ever experienced, which was improbable and true simultaneously. I have been afraid, he said quietly, against her temple, for approximately 4 months, that something would happen to you here, that the court would prove dangerous in ways I could not anticipate, that my world would damage you simply by your proximity to it. I knew what your world was when I stayed in it, she said. You knew some of it. I knew enough. She tilted her head slightly, meeting his eyes from inches away. I am not delicate, Ambrose. I know. His hand came up and cupped her face, and his thumb traced her cheekbone with a care that was slow and precise and full of something she did not have a word for. I know exactly who you are. I have been cataloguing it for 8 months. A pause. May I kiss you? I believe in asking. Yes, she said, obviously. The kiss was quiet and unhurried, and nothing like the electric drama she would have expected from an 800-year-old vampire duke in the middle of a political crisis, which meant it was entirely characteristic of him, because Ambrose Drazhan expressed intensity through restraint, through slowness, through a focused attention that made everything else in the room cease to exist. She put her hand against his jaw and felt the tension there, and felt him ease into her touch, and it was the most honest exchange she had ever been part of. Above them, in the grand hall, Elder Threnody was methodically dismantling a 6-year conspiracy. The quorum convened in full 4 hours after Iris named the elders in the grand chamber. 9 unaligned witnesses, all of them resident in Vienna, all summoned by Threnody using the court's emergency procedural protocols, which Morvain could not block without making the obstruction visible to the entire network. The documentation Iris had gathered was formally entered into evidence. She presented it herself, standing in the center of the hall in her grey uniform, because there had not been time to change, and because she decided somewhere in the walk up from the study that she did not need to change. She was who she was in this room, and what she was wearing was not the relevant thing. She answered every question the quorum put to her in the old tongue for the sections that required it, having learned enough of it in the archive over 8 months to manage formal testimony. She could see Dorvath's expression change when she shifted into the old tongue without prompting, the faint recalculation visible even in those ancient violet eyes. The quorum, methodical and procedurally rigorous in the way that only immortal bureaucrats could be, went through every document with slow and meticulous care. Ambrose stood at her right throughout, slightly behind her, not speaking unless the quorum addressed him directly. His presence at her shoulder was a constant warm-edged awareness when one of the quorum members, an elder named Drazhan Oscu, asked her a question in a tone that was on the boundary between formal and threatening. Ambrose stepped forward by exactly 2 inches and said nothing, but Drazhan Oscu looked at him and adjusted his tone immediately. It was the most efficient use of implied menace she had ever witnessed, and she appreciated it enormously. The determination took 3 more hours. When it came just before dawn, it was unambiguous. The covenant of unfit stewardship invocation was ruled falsified. The evidence presented by the 6 invoking elders was determined to be fabricated, misrepresented, or coerced in each of its 3 counts. The inverted covenant provision was formally triggered. Elder Morvain, Elder Vaughan, Elder Rue, Elder Halvain, Elder Seravain, and Elder Dorvath were each stripped of their positions, their territorial authorities, and their court standing, pending a full tribunal that would be convened within 30 days by the network's central administrative body in Prague. Morvain's face when the determination was read was the blankest thing she had ever seen, and she suspected it was blank because whatever was behind it was too large to contain in an expression. He looked at Iris once before the chamber guard flanked him, and she met his gaze without flinching. 800 years, he said to her, and his voice was so quiet only she and Ambrose would have heard it, and a human woman undid all of it. 8 months, she said, and You should have paid better attention to who was in the room. Threnody, passing behind her, made a sound that might, on a much less ancient and severe face, have been a laugh, in the grey light of the early morning, 3 floors above the underground court. There was a small office in the hotel's closed east wing that Iris had informally claimed over the previous 8 months, and which contained her reference books, her laptop, several handwritten cipher keys, and a very good electric kettle that she had brought from home. She sat at the desk, the cup of tea, the kind of enormous fatigue that followed sustained adrenaline settling into her bones, and listened to the sounds of the court below her, still processing the aftermath of the night. Footsteps, doors, the formal, careful voices of the quorum members consulting on procedural next steps. Ambrose came in 30 minutes later and sat in the chair across from her desk, the one she had put there 2 months ago, because he had started appearing in the office to think. And the act of thinking, in silence, was apparently something he preferred to do with other people, specifically her. He still wore the torn coat. She suspected he had forgotten about it. They sat in comfortable quiet for several minutes, the city beginning its morning sounds through the building above them, the muffled movement of a world that did not know what had happened in the rooms below its feet. "Daniel will need to be told," Iris said eventually. "About what I was doing here and why I came." "Yes." Ambrose looked at his hands, then at her. "He will also need to be told that his employer intends to ask his sister to remain in Vienna permanently, if she is willing." She looked at him. "Permanently is a long time. I am aware. I have a good sense of scale for permanence." His eyes held steady on her face. "I am also aware that you are 24 and human, and have a life that exists outside of underground courts and vampire politics. I am not asking you to abandon that. I am asking you to consider a version of your future that includes this place and, as me, and whatever we might build from what has happened between us, with complete transparency about what that means long term." The long term with a vampire was something she had thought about. It was impossible not to. He would outlive her by centuries, in the ordinary course of things, and that was a weight that sat in the middle of anything that might grow between them, real and non-negotiable. "The ordinary course of things," she said, thinking aloud, "is not the only course available within your world." He looked at her carefully. "No, it is not. There are choices. I will not pretend otherwise. They are significant choices, and I would never press them, and they are years in the future, if they are ever relevant at all. But they exist." A pause. "I want many years of you exactly as you are first, before anything else is discussed. I want mornings like this one, and the arguments you have with the inventory system, and you explaining things in that precise voice, and the way you look when you have just decoded something difficult." His voice had gone very quiet. "I want to know you across time. I have wanted that for months, and I am done being disciplined about not saying it." Iris set down her tea. She stood up, moved around the desk, and sat on the edge of it, nearest his chair, which put her at his eye level, roughly, and closer than the desk usually allowed. He looked up at her, and in the grey morning light filtering through the building above them, his white hair and pale face were very clear, very present, and his crimson eyes were the colour they were when he was paying attention to something with everything he had. "I want that too," she said. "The years, the ordinary version of it, to grow into whatever this is properly, without rushing." She held his gaze. "I stayed here for 8 months because I am not impulsive, but I made a decision 3 months ago that I have been being very disciplined about not acting on, and I would like to stop being disciplined about it now." He stood, which brought him close, and she tipped her chin up to hold his gaze. "I love you," he said, and the words were so plain and unadorned and simply true that they hit her in the chest like the first line of a proof. "I am aware that is a significant thing to say and fully meaning it." "I love you," she said back with equal plainness, because she had figured out some weeks ago that the most honest thing she could do with what she felt for this person was simply say it, and that being honest about it was not vulnerability, it was precision. 843 years old, she added, and it took a Maid with a flash drive to make you say it. He put his arms around her, and she felt him exhale, actually exhale, in the way that was not physiological necessity but emotional release, the kind of breath that said something long held in tension had finally been put down. She pressed her face against his shoulder, the cool solidity of him, the reality of him, and felt something settle in her chest that she thought might be the feeling of having arrived somewhere she was supposed to be. "The court going to require a great deal of reorganization," he said against her hair. "I know. I made preliminary notes on structural reforms 3 weeks ago. They are in the 3rd folder from the left on my desktop." His chest moved against her cheek. "You made preliminary restructuring notes for my court. I thought they might be useful." "They will be extraordinary," he said, "because everything you do is extraordinary. I have established this. It is a fact." The weeks that followed were the most intensely busy of Iris's life, and she had once spent 3 months sleeping 4 hours a night while finishing her thesis and working 2 jobs simultaneously. The tribunal preparation required documentation, formal presentation of evidence, and representation before the Prague administrative body, for which Iris found herself serving as what amounted to chief archivist and strategic consultant, a role that had no formal title because it had never existed before, because no human had ever been in a position to occupy it. She called Daniel the morning after the tribunal ruling. He answered on the 2nd ring, which meant he had been awake, which at his end of the call was 3 in the morning. "Iris," he said, and his voice had the particular pitch of someone who already knew or had been warned that a call was coming. "You are alive," she said. "You could have told me." A long silence. I know I should have. Celia and I, we were just not ready to explain the whole thing, and I did not know how to explain half of it, without explaining all of it, and I did not know if you would be safe knowing about this world. And then I found out you had taken a job at the Vienna court, and I tried to get a message back to you, but everything happened very fast, and I thought the Duke would protect you, and I was not wrong, except you apparently protected him first." Another pause. "He told me this morning what you did. He called you. He said he wanted to tell me himself. He said you were the most remarkable person he had ever met in 800 years, and that he intended to spend a very long time making sure you knew it, and that he thought I should hear that from him directly." Daniel's voice had gone slightly thick. "He also said that he owed me an apology for not finding a way to tell you sooner that I was all right, regardless of my request, because he has come to understand what it means to have someone be afraid for the people they love." Iris closed her eyes. "He said that, word for word, as far as I could tell. He does not seem like a man who speaks loosely. He is not," she said. "He is extremely precise." "Are you happy?" Daniel asked, and the simplicity of the question, the direct and uncomplicated brotherly concern of it, was the most human thing she had heard in days. "I think I am," she said. "I think I am going to be, for a very long time. The tribunal convened in Prague 6 weeks after the Vienna ruling, and it was everything the Vienna procedure had been but amplified, older, grander, more formally weighted, in a chamber beneath a Baroque palace in the old city that had been operating continuously since the 17th century. Iris attended as a formally recognized court witness, which required Ambrose to file a procedural motion for human witness standing, which had not been done since 1938. The Prague administrative body argued about it for 2 hours before Iris sent a written brief to the presiding elder that was, by all accounts, the most precisely argued procedural memo the chamber had seen in decades, citing 11 distinct precedents across 4 different court systems. They granted the standing. She later learned that the presiding elder had gone directly to Ambrose after reading it and asked who she was, and that Ambrose had said, with what she imagined was a deeply controlled pride, that she was Iris Wren, she was his, and the court should probably get used to encountering her. The 6 elders were found guilty of conspiring against the Vienna blood seat, of fabricating evidence under blood law, and of violating the ancient vow of council integrity that every elder swore at their ascension. The forfeiture provisions of the inverted covenant took effect immediately. It was the largest redistribution of vampire territorial authority in 4 centuries, and it happened because of 8 months of careful observation by a woman in a grey uniform that everyone had assumed was not paying attention, Morvain was the last to be formally divested. As his council mark was removed, a ritual that was quiet and formal and surprisingly undramatic given the weight it carried, he looked once more at the witness table where Iris sat. She thought he was going to say something cruel. Instead, he said, "You understood the covenant better than any of us. That is something I will be thinking about for a long time." She nodded once. That was all. It was enough. Winter came to Vienna, with the weight of something earned, grey skies and cold mornings, and the city lit warmly against the dark. The underground court underwent its restructuring with the steady efficiency of an institution that had learned, at considerable cost, the danger of its own self-satisfaction. New protocols were established for human staff that were not about restriction but about integration, a formal acknowledgement that the humans who moved through the court were not furniture, were not invisible, and would henceforth be treated with the kind of attention their presence and their trust deserved. Iris kept the East Wing office. She expanded it slightly, because the restructuring documentation kept accumulating, and because Ambrose kept appearing to think in silence, and because the chair across from her desk had effectively become his. She gave it a proper cushion, eventually, and he pretended not to notice the gesture with a dignity that she found deeply endearing. 3 months after the tribunal, Daniel came to Vienna with Celia. They had dinner in the court's formal dining room, the 4 of them, which was the first time Iris had eaten a meal in that room that was not while working, and the strangeness of sitting at the long table as a guest rather than a servant had an odd emotional weight to it that she had not anticipated. Ambrose and Daniel spoke for a long time after dinner. In the way of 2 people who had a shared reference point, they were finally able to address openly, and Iris sat with Celia, who was clever and warm, and who looked at Daniel the way Ambrose looked at Iris, with the particular quality of attention that said, "You are the thing I am aware of in any room." "You are good for him," Celia said to Iris quietly. "He has been careful for so long, careful in the way that means keeping people at a distance so they cannot be used against you. It is a very old survival strategy." She looked across the room to where Ambrose was listening to Daniel with genuine attention, his pale profile lit by the candlelight. "He is not careful with you." "It is the first time I have seen that in a very long time." "He is protective," Iris said. "Yes, but protection and distance are different things. He would protect you with everything he has and still keep you close." Celia smiled. "That is the harder thing to allow. He allows it with you." Later, after Daniel and Celia had gone to the guest rooms and the court had quieted to its usual late-night industry, Iris and Ambrose walked through the east corridor, the long one with the arched ceiling and the display cases of court documents going back 4 centuries. It was something they had started doing in the last few weeks. This walking without particular destination, the simple act of being in motion together through the space they shared. He had his hands clasped behind his back, which was his default posture when he was thinking, and the candlelight set the corridor, made his white hair almost silver. She walked beside him, and their shoulders were close enough to nearly touch. That half-inch of charged space that they had stopped pretending was purely incidental. "I would like," he said, at the end of the corridor, turning to face her, "to tell you something I have been thinking about." "Tell me." "I intend to love you for a very long time," he said. "I intend for this to be the kind of thing that takes up the center of my life, not the edges of it. I have spent many centuries running this court, navigating this world, and doing it well, I believe, but doing it in a way that kept me slightly apart from everything, because I believed that was the correct posture for a blood-seat sovereign." His eyes were very steady on hers, that deep burgundy of genuine and complete attention. "I do not believe that anymore. I believe the correct posture is to be fully present in what matters, and you matter more than I have adequate language for, even in 8 languages. Iris looked at him for a moment. "You speak 8 languages. I do, and in none of them do you have adequate language for what you feel. Correct? That is the most romantic thing anyone has ever said to me," she said, and stepped forward and put her arms around his neck, and he put his around her waist, and they stood in the candlelit corridor beneath 4 centuries of documented history, and held each other with the particular quality of 2 people who have come through something significant together and arrived on the other side of it, intact and together, and grateful for both. Spring brought changes that felt less like disruption and more like conclusion, the closing of a circle that had been open for too long. The Prague administrative body formally ratified all of the restructuring protocols Iris had drafted, which was either unprecedented or merely very uncommon, depending on who you asked, and which resulted in the Human Staff Integration Charter becoming a formal component of Vienna's court governance documents. Iris did not particularly care about the symbolic significance of that. She cared that it was real and that it would hold. She also received, in the same week, a message from Interpol. Her contact there, the one she had prepared as a fail-safe and who she had never actually triggered, because the vampiric procedural system had handled everything internally, had been patiently waiting for her check-in, and had finally sent a query, asking if everything was all right. She wrote back, truthfully, that it was, and that the evidence she had sent was related to a matter that had been fully resolved through its own institutional channels, and that she appreciated his patience. He wrote back asking if she was available for consulting work, because the brief she had sent was some of the best structured documentary evidence his team had seen. She kept that option open, with Ambrose's knowledge and support, because she was Iris Wren. and she did not stop doing useful things simply because her circumstances had changed. On the morning of the spring equinox, which mattered in the vampire court calendar for reasons she now understood thoroughly, she was standing at the east wing window looking at the grey-blue sky above Vienna when Ambrose came to stand beside her. He had a coffee for her, which he set on the windowsill in the way he had been doing for 8 months in various rooms of the court, and he stood close enough that she could feel the cool presence of him at her shoulder. "I want to ask you something," he said. She picked up the coffee. "Ask me." He turned to face her, and there was something in his expression that was both completely controlled and completely unguarded simultaneously, which was the contradiction that she had come to think of as the truest face of him, the one he showed only when he was being entirely himself, without performance or management. In his hand was something she had not seen before, a small thing, a ring, which appeared to be very old, set with a deep red stone that in the morning light looked almost exactly the color of his eyes when he was happy. "This was made 400 years ago," he said, "by a court jeweler who was commissioned to make something for a blood seat sovereign to give to the person he wished to share his life with. I have kept it for 400 years without using it, which sounds like neglect, but which I prefer to think of as patience." His voice was very steady. "It is not an ordinary ring. In the context of this court and this blood law, it carries formal significance. It means partnership acknowledged publicly, irreversibly. It means that you stand at my side in this court as someone who is mine and whom I am equally theirs, with all the protection and weight that carries." He met her eyes. "It also means more simply that I love you, and I want that to be a permanent and public fact." Iris looked at the ring. She looked at Ambrose. She thought about the grey-uniformed woman she had been 8 months ago, standing in the hotel elevator on her way to an underground court with a cover story and a flash drive and a missing brother, with no intention of falling in love and every intention of being useful. She thought about how love was, in its actual experience, nothing like the passive thing it was sometimes described as, not falling into, but choosing, daily and specifically, with full knowledge of what you were choosing and why. "Yes," she said, and held out her hand. He put the ring on her finger with both of his hands, which was not required by the gesture, but which was characteristic of him, that thoroughness, that deliberateness, the way he did nothing carelessly when it mattered. The stone caught the morning light and threw a brief red scatter across the windowsill between them. He raised her hand to his mouth and pressed his lips to her knuckles, slowly, and looked at her over them with those crimson eyes that she knew better now than she knew most things in the world. "Iris Wren," he said, for what she counted as the 6th time in exactly that particular tone of deliberate care. "Ambrose Drazhan," she replied in the same tone, because it deserved to be said back to him, his name, the specific fact of who he was to her, held carefully, and said with intention. He smiled. It was one of the genuinely rare ones, not the controlled almost smile he used in formal settings, but the real one, which transformed his face completely, and which she had been cataloguing for months, and which she intended to keep cataloguing for the foreseeable future. Through the window above them, the city of Vienna moved through its spring morning, ordinary and unaware. Below them, the court hummed with the sounds of a restructured institution, finding its new shape. Somewhere in Bucharest, Daniel Wren was probably waking up beside Stelia and thinking about calling his sister, who was no longer a maid in grey, but who was also, in all the ways that mattered, exactly the same person she had always been. the kind who paid attention, who did not flinch, who understood that the most important things you could do in any room were observe carefully, document honestly, and stay. She had come here looking for something she had lost and had found it. She had also found, in the underground corridors of an ancient court that had not known what to make of her, something she had not known she was looking for, a person who looked at her across 8 months of careful distance and found that distance insufficient, a world that was dangerous and old and full of hidden laws, and which now had her name in its governance document, a life that was nothing she had planned and everything that fit. She leaned against Ambrose's shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they stood together in the morning light that came down through the old hotel above them, quiet and present, and entirely certain of where they were, which was here, which was this, which was home. In the court below, Elder Threnody was already at his desk, because he was always already at his desk, and the new procedural codes were open in front of him, and the name Iris Wren appeared twice in the first 3 pages, once as chief archivist and once as partner to the Duke of the Blood Seat, and he read both with the expression of someone who had seen 800 years of courts and politics and ancient vows, and who had, on balance, rarely seen a better outcome than this one. Above him, in the East Wing office with the too small window, and the excellent kettle, and the chair that now had a proper cushion, the morning moved forward into day, and the spring light came down through Vienna, and the woman who had walked into a vampire court with a plan, and come out with something much larger and truer, held her coffee in one hand and the future in the other, and was not afraid of either.